Again, so if you have any questions, we'll definitely have time at the end of the presentation to take those. Just put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. I think that's all with housekeeping. So hopefully you all are here for place-based education in the garden. This is part one of a two-part series. So I'll talk a little bit about part two as we go through this class. But really place-based education, I should also preface this by saying, ideally this class would be taught in person in a place, because that really has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about tonight. But for the sake of accessibility and an evening class, we decided to do this virtually. Just so you know, if you wanted to teach this topic to other teachers or as a PD, I would recommend kind of modeling it in a space. Just a quick overview of Seed St. Louis. Our mission is to educate and empower people to grow food. We're currently celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we have over 250 community and school garden projects in our network. You can find out more about those resources that we offer, gardens in the network, on our website. You can also find other classes and events on our website. Please check that out. So just a little overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to start by just talking about what place-based education is. It's kind of a buzzword in education. You may have heard it. You may know a little bit about it. Maybe you don't, but you should after this is over with. And then I'm going to talk about 6 design principles that are kind of the foundations for place-based education. I'm going to also then talk a little bit about some implementation methods of place-based education. And I should back up and say that Dean will also be talking about some native crops. And do you want to mention kind of some of the things that you'll be sharing too? I know.
Well, I was sharing. Yeah, so I'll be talking about some native crops, kind of ones that are indigenous to the area, kind of like how they were used, what you could use them for. And then I'll also be giving some examples at the end of using place-based education and how that can work in the garden, using kind of some garden issues that you might have.
So yeah, so Dean kind of covered the rest of that. So I want to start out, before I give into what place-based education is, I just want to do a quick little polls. First, I want to find out who is here. So this is multiple, so you should be able to select multiple choices here. So if you're an elementary educator and a St. Louis resident, please select both of those. I just want to get an idea who is here tonight. Oh, we have an administrator, garden leader. Very nice. Okay, it's from outside of the St. Louis region. So this is going to be kind of focused on like our local area, but I think this is still very useful. Even if you are out of the state of Missouri, you should still be able to use all of this. Maybe just not some of the few specific examples we give, but I think this should still give you a lot to work with. Okay, very cool. A nice variety of backgrounds. Now, the next poll I would like to do, the last one, is just to find out what your level of comfort is with place-based education, or, oops, wrong one, sorry, I'm new to these polls. So I just want to know how, there's the other poll out. Okay, it's not there. It's okay. Do you know? Usually there's a second option. Sorry. There it is. Okay. So if you could just select one answer here, how familiar you are with place-based education? Not at all. You've heard of it, but you're not sure if you're using it. You use some principles when you teach others, if you're a teacher, or you often use it. Great. Looks like we have a variety of experience levels too. So this class is really just kind of an overview of it. I mean, I think we'll dive a little deeper into some of the principles and give you some ideas, even if you're familiar with it, but it is just kind of a general overview so that you feel comfortable using place-based education in the garden or in your community after this class. So I'm just going to jump right in and do talking about what place-based education is. And you might hear me also say place-based learning, same thing. So place-based education is, I included a definition from David Sobel, who's credited with being kind of one of the founders of this philosophy, but that's really what it is. It's just a philosophy in teaching. There's not one right way to do it. You can take pieces of it. You can make your units completely place-based. So it's kind of a continuum and a philosophy. So yeah, you can take what you want from it. But we like to think of it as kind of a triangle where you're learning within a place. So that place could be your school garden. It could be out in your community. It could be anywhere, really, usually ideally outside of the classroom. And your learning is immersed in that place. So you're looking at it from an angle of ecology, economy, as well as culture. But you also want to think about the prism of the history of that place as well as the future. So David Sobel defines place-based education as using the local community environment as a starting point to teach all concepts in the curriculum. He emphasizes hands-on learning and real-world learning, and immersing yourself in the natural world to create a heightened commitment to serving as active, contributing citizens. So with that being said, kind of the goal of place-based education, aside from teaching the curriculum or the content, your standards to the students, what makes this a little different is that it also should have an impact on the community. That could be the smaller school community, it could be the greater community or neighborhood, but also you hope one of the goals of place-based education is to engage students and teachers. So again, using that real-world learning, making it relevant to them, and hopefully also boosting academic outcomes because you are taking these concepts and applying it to what they're familiar with. So also with that, I should say, I mean, when we think about goals as educators, really the main goal is to make students productive members of society, right? No matter what you're teaching, that really is the ultimate goal of an educator. So one thing that I think is special about place-based education is that you're really showing them how to be productive members in society. So they're not just learning math in a classroom, they're taking it out and using it in the world that they're going to live in. Two quotes that I like kind of connect to place-based education. One is by Edward Casey, who is a philosopher that studies specifically space and place. And he says that we are surrounded by places. We walk over and through them. We live in places, relate to others in them, die in them. Nothing we do is unplaced. How could it be otherwise? How could we fail to recognize this primal fact? So this is just makes me think about like, why are we spending so much time in the classroom? And this is such a good point, and why, again, like why would we spend all this time teaching students how to be productive members of society anywhere other than out in these places that they will be living and thriving? And then I also just love this Maya Angelou quote: if it's true that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, isn't it also true as that a society is only as healthy as its sickest citizen and wealthy as its most deprived? I like this because it really highlights like community, civic responsibility, and I think it just helps us to think about our place in the greater scheme of things. And since place-based education really is intended to have kind of a community impact, help us raise people who will be better stewards of the earth and the community, I like this quote to kind of set the tone. So in thinking about how place-based education is different from maybe traditional or project-based, because it's really very similar to project-based, I just wanted to kind of give some examples. So for example, if you're teaching about maybe erosion, like water control and like science earth systems unit, a traditional unit might be reading that from a textbook, seeing a PowerPoint or a lecture about it, and then maybe doing some kind of small activity to reinforce that and then taking a test over it. I think a lot of us are getting away from that traditional way of teaching. You see a lot more project-based, which may look like reading an article on a current event related to flooding or water erosion, and then maybe doing a little research on that topic, some kind of hands-on activity, and then often designing like a model and presenting that. So that's really project-based learning is really learning it in real-world context, but I see place-based as learning it in like their world, if that makes sense. So you're not just thinking about how does the stuff we're learning in the classroom apply in the real world, it's more how does it apply in my world? So it's really connecting it to the world that I'm familiar with, my community. So that could look like identifying a problem that's actually happening, maybe related to maybe studying the Mississippi River, looking at maps like meandering maps that show how the river has changed over time. Maybe reading historical documents, or even doing your own tests, like setting up erosion control test around the schoolyard, maybe meeting with like stormwater management people in the city. So really applying it to the places that we inhabit. Also creating real world solutions. So not just a model, but really coming up with a solution that can help to address that problem. So before I could get into the principles and let Dean talk a little bit about some native crops, I first want to just talk about decolonizing our understanding of places, since place-based education is all about learning out in the world in these spaces. It's really important that we first have those conversations that need to be had to address things that might come up. So considering the students or the people you're working with, there are certain individual connections to spaces. Some may be positive, some may be negative, or it's the same with just learning out in nature. It's always important to consider those things and address those things beforehand, and facilitating conversations, whether they may be a little uncomfortable, but it's important to have those talking about our understanding of places, the naming of places, why things are named certain ways, and exploring just the full history of a place. So you can't really talk about like food access in St. Louis without talking about like redlining and these historical like racist practices. So it's just important to think about, again, not just how things are now, but how did they get that way, and who are the people that have inhabited them, those kinds of things. So it's always important, if you're going to do a place-based unit, to kind of consider all of those things. And another way you can do that is to facilitate the learning and understanding of native crops and plants that have cultural importance among Indigenous people. So I'm going to let Dean talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So particularly when we're talking about like the history of the space here in the St. Louis area, we have some of the longest human history that we know about, at least kind of in what is now the United States. So Cahokia is kind of what is most famous in terms of indigenous systems in the area, but there were indigenous people for many thousands of years before that as well. But there has been a lot of research at Cahokia, and so there's some really good records in terms of like what was grown there, what is grown here, and then even the European kind of history and African history in the St. Louis area is really long compared to a lot of the other areas around here, because we have all these big rivers that made it easy for people to get here. And so, but a couple that we can talk about. One, there's just way too many to mention here in terms of all the different plants that people have interacted with in this place, for all the many reasons that people interact with plants. But one of the things that I do always like to draw people's attention to is this concept called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. So something that a lot of people don't know is, if you're studying in social studies or whatever, and they're talking about kind of the origins of agriculture, there's this idea of like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where like they domesticated wheat and cattle and pigs and lentils and peas and all those different things. And then like in the Andes they domesticated things, and in Mexico they domesticated things. And there's all these places that we talk about, but there is also one of those origin points here in what is now the Midwestern United States. And most of the research around that domestication event have happened here just east of St. Louis on the Illinois side, in kind of the Cahokia area. And those crops that were domesticated in that domestication event, this happened before the introduction of corn. Corn was absolutely important to Indigenous people in the recent history, but corn was only introduced, I think it was about 1,000 years ago, and Indigenous people have been here for like, I think there's now data for at least like 25,000 or so. And so they've been growing many things before that. So these were things that were domesticated before the introduction of corn and beans from what is now Mexico. The only two that still really exist as crops and that you are probably familiar with is sunflowers. So sunflowers were domesticated in the Midwest, and it's one of the reasons why they grow so well here and why they're such an indestructible flower, because they can handle all the crazy things that our weather likes to throw at us. And sunflowers are a really great one to grow for many reasons. One, because they're just kind of absurd. I mean, you can see how large this flower is next to this full-grown adult. So this is, it's beautiful. It helps with pollination. There's a couple other things later on that I'll talk about that it can benefit for. But also, I mean, it is of course also edible to people. The seeds themselves, can be consumed directly, as many people are familiar. They also make a really great seed to do sprouting or microgreens, which is a fun thing to do kind of inside or in winter time that you can do from sunflowers. The other one that people are familiar with that we still grow from this kind of suite of crops is squash, specifically Cucurbita pepo subspecies ovifera. So there's many types of squash, and the reason that I put that specifically is that's also going to come back later in some examples. But those squash that we still grow that are from those that were actually domesticated here in St. Louis originally are things like acorn squash, kind of the ornamental gourds. So not bottle gourds, but like those kind of warty gourds that they sell around Halloween and Thanksgiving. And then patty pan squash, which is what this picture up here is. We're all domesticated and grown here in the St. Louis area for many thousands of years. There's also some other things that are really at this point have kind of rewilded themselves and are now considered weeds, but that were domesticated and grown in fields by people on purpose. So one of them is little barley, which is just a really fun plant because it just looks like somebody took a wheat plant and hit it with a shrink ray. So it only gets about this big, but you can see, this person's fingers, it's these little tiny seed heads. They have little seeds in them that look like little mini wheat. And they grow over winter. So they grow usually in like really rocky areas. You'll see them kind of along gravel driveways a lot. But you plant them in the fall, they're ready in like May. You can plant them on purpose if you want, but they do also grow pretty commonly. Another one that you can plant, but that also a related species grows is Chenopodium. So quinoa is a Chenopodium. That's a Chenopodium that was domesticated in South America. But Chenopodium was also domesticated in Mesoamerica, and it was also domesticated here in the Midwest. So this one here, Chenopodium berlandieri, is the one that was domesticated here. So this is a picture of it here. It looks a lot like lamb's quarters. So the things that grow wild in many of our gardens. So those lamb quarters that grow wild are almost all a European species, but they can be used almost exactly the same way. So you can still use them as kind of a way of interacting with them. And the whole plant is edible, which we'll again talk about later. And then these are some other ones that I probably wouldn't recommend growing, but that were also domesticated here, just if you're interested. So maygrass.
Good for a study, a place-based education study.
Yeah, so still like for education information would be good, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend growing. Maygrass just because it's almost impossible to find. Sumpweed is really beautiful. It's really cool, but it's highly allergenic. Like when I process it, because I do grow it, I have to like wear an N95 and then take a shower afterwards. Otherwise, like my whole face swells up. So like probably not great for kids.
That's really great.
I know, but it is really fun. And then the last one, erect knotweed, is another one that was grown for the seeds. Is almost impossible to get the seed for. But if you reach out to some of the researchers, really the only people researching these crops still are at WashU, so here in St. Louis, and they're really great, really happy to share information. So in the garden, those are kind of the native crops that I like to talk about. But there is also a great suite of fruit and nut crops that are from here, and many of them were harvested, but also cultivated in some way, or even like farmed in a classic sense by indigenous people. But again, too many to mention all the many fruit and nuts that were consumed. But the biggest ones are pecan and persimmon. I want to tell little stories about because I think they're relevant. So one, pecan, I think is really significant here. It can be difficult to grow simply because it's huge. The tree can get like 100 feet tall and wide eventually. It's just a really big tree. But it is really significant to this area because the first European records of pecans are actually from the Kaskaskia River Valley. So just across the river. And for the first like 200-300 years of European colonization, they were actually called Illinois nuts. Pecan is kind of a mispronunciation of an indigenous name for the plant. But they were from Illinois, and the records that the French said is basically that like they were being farmed in the floodplains is essentially what the French records showed. And many of the pecan cultivars that you can grow this far north were found in what are literally called wild orchards along the river valleys of the St. Louis area, which is to say they were indigenous orchards and the indigenous people were forced off and then people discovered them later on. So many of the pecans that you can actually grow here are literally like remnants of these indigenous orchards. And the other thing that I think is interesting about the pecan story is that many people are shocked to hear that you can even grow pecans here because we associate them with the South. The reason we associate them with the South is that it took like 200 years for people to figure out how to graft them. And the person who figured out how to graft them was an enslaved man in New Orleans. And so he was grafting pecans that grew in Louisiana. And so that was kind of what the industry came out of, was these people who figured out how to do it in the Deep South. And those pecans will not grow here, but there are pecans that will grow here. And in my opinion, the ones that grow here are better. Probably because they were domesticated for several thousand years by indigenous people. But they do tend to be a little smaller, but they are a little like different than the ones at the grocery store, but really good. And then persimmon kind of have a similar story. So the American persimmon, there's the wild ones, you know, that you'll just like find growing all over the place. But there's this weird genetic thing where some of them have 60 chromosomes, some of them have 90 chromosomes. I can't remember which is which. You can look it up easily. But one of those is common throughout the South, but there's pockets of the other one throughout the South. And then that one is all throughout the northern US. And essentially what they have now figured out is that the reason that there's pockets of it in the South is that that northern variety is better for food and indigenous people were moving it and planting it. So clearly they were intentionally planting it and growing it. But the reason that I like to talk about persimmon specifically for the St. Louis area is that the first persimmon cultivar, which is kind of the parent of really all of the persimmon cultivars that you will find, was first discovered or was first named and kind of brought into the horticulture trade when they found it growing in a fence row in Alton, Illinois. So again, just right across the river in the St. Louis region is really where kind of all of the genetics for our native persimmon come from. And so I like the stories that I think are interesting, and then you can kind of dive down some history of those, or like why were they being grown there, or like, well, how did they get into the trade, or why is it called a wild orchard, or you know, or stuff like that. And there's like different things that you can look at. But then there are a lot of these other fruit too that are great that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on. But pawpaws, black raspberries, service berries, aronias, elderberries, maypop, and hazelnut are all local crops that grow wild here. The only one I am going to mention, just because a lot of people haven't heard of it, is maypop, which is actually a native passion fruit. So like the passion fruit that you get at the store that grows in the tropics, we actually have a native species. And this is what the flower looks like. It's a vine, and then you get this little fruit on the inside, tastes just like passion fruit. And they grow beautifully. And this maypop, the pecan, the persimmon, the pawpaw, and the aronia and the hazelnut are all really great with school schedules as well. They're ripe when school is in session. So black raspberries and service berries and elderberries, unfortunately, usually ripen in the summer, which is a bummer. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Dean. So now I'm going to jump in to the 6 principles of place-based education, and maybe some of the things Dean just mentioned will kind of come up in your mind as we talk about these, as you think of like examples and ways you could do this. So as I said, place-based education, there isn't a one way of doing it. It's more, again, of a philosophy. So you can take parts of it and weave it into your learning or into your teaching. And I'll talk after I go through these principles about 2 ways you can kind of implement if you're kind of new to place-based education, ways you can start trying to implement it more into your teaching. But even just thinking about each of these principles, so this is really the only structure there is with place-based education I found are these principles. You know, it's done in many different ways, but you don't even have to use all 6 of these principles in your teaching to be doing place-based education. So as I go through them, maybe you can just kind of think about ways that you could take some of these and start folding them into your teaching. So the first one is community as classroom. So if you are already teaching outside or in the garden, you're already doing this. So community as classroom is really just teaching outside of the classroom, learning within the context of whatever it is you're learning about. So maybe that's teaching in the garden rather than teaching like life cycles from a science book in the classroom. You're teaching it out in the garden, looking at these life cycles and plants. But it could also be out in the community. So like taking field trips or even bringing guest speakers. And so it's using the community as the classroom. For each of these principles, I have kind of a guiding question that you can think about or that students can think about when they're doing this. So like one question, kind of guiding question for community's classroom is, when you're in a space learning, who are the indigenous inhabitants of this place? Who lives here now? What systems do we see at work here? And just some examples of ways you can kind of implement community in a classroom in your teaching. So again, using the garden as a tool to teach the core content is doing that. As I mentioned, going out into the community. So I'm giving some examples here kind of related to like food access, that kind of thing, but you can do this in many ways. But if you were trying to teach students more about like food access, then maybe interviewing nonprofits in the area, Operation Food Search in St. Louis, reaching out to Earth Dance Farms or these other places that students can learn from or go and visit. Exploring community assets is a great thing to do here. So if you've ever heard of asset-based community development, it is a way of kind of looking at what your community has versus what it needs. So this is a great activity to do with students if they're doing any kind of place-based learning unit. So thinking about whatever their project is, whatever the problem is that they've identified that they want to find a solution to, a good place to start would be kind of mapping out what assets exist in the community. So thinking about who are some people in the community that have skills that could help us with this, with our research, with our design, our solution design, thinking about what businesses exist, what groups, associations, cultures, hospitals, parks, libraries, all these things. So this can be a great activity for students to do to kind of set up their place-based learning when they're starting to collect data and look for a solution to whatever the problem is that they've identified. Also visiting like other community food gardens that exist, which we can definitely help you do. If you want to do that, you can reach out to us and we can connect you with many of the community gardens in the area. Visiting historical sites. So like, for example, Cahokia Mounds, to learn about historical agricultural practices and crops that Dean just mentioned, or visiting like a nature reserve to learn more about native plants and how that all works together, how native plants benefit wildlife and so on. So the next principle of place-based education is that it is learner-centered. This is really common with any outdoor education. You always want it to be student-centered, learner-centered. So you want to make sure it's relevant to the students and that they're really kind of taking charge of their learning. You're kind of there just as a guide to guide them through it. So with learner-centered, students are in charge of choosing the issue that's important to them, whether it's individually or as a group. But you want to make sure that they care about what it is they're learning. That doesn't mean that you can't still be in control of like what the standards are, but you're giving them options and making sure that it's something relevant to them. So a question that they could ask here is, what influence do I have on my community and how is my identity connected to my community? This can kind of help them to find things that are important to them. So some ways of going about implementing that is, again, students engage in an open exploration of a place. So once they've kind of identified something they're interested in, whether it's the garden, I mean, with any lessons that we teach in the garden, they all have a component of just open student exploration. They have a guiding question that they're looking for some answers to, but letting them be free to kind of explore and make those observations. But that can be done out in other areas too in the community. Facilitating peer-to-peer discussion. So you're not just talking back and forth to the students, but you're finding ways to set them up to share what they've learned and learn from each other. Having student form committees and student leadership opportunities, and also having students set daily goals and reflection. It's a way for them to really take charge of their project and what they're learning. The third design principle of place-based education is that it's inquiry-based. So it's all grounded in observing, asking questions, and making predictions and collecting data. You're probably doing a lot of this already if you are using the garden as an educational tool. So something, if you've ever had me out for a class or a PD, you've heard this. What do I notice? What do I wonder? And what does this remind me of? So this is just a really easy way to get students to do three parts of scientific thinking, because when they're asking, what do I notice? They're making observations. What do I wonder? They're asking questions. And what does this remind me of? They're making connections to things they're familiar with. So that's a really good way to start, having students thinking about the answers to those three questions, but also using tools like magnifying glasses, nature journals, cameras, nature apps, specifically like when they're out in the garden learning or in a nature space, but also utilizing things like question walls for them to ask questions about a place that they're learning in, practicing ways to engage all their senses. There are lots of little things that they can do to practice that, and I think those we'll go more into depth with those in part 2. And using the tools or creating tools like surveys, journals, maps, graphs, and other infographics as they collect their data. Here's just some examples. Nature journaling I love, and it's a great tool for place-based learning because a journal, a pad of paper and a pencil is really easy for students to carry around. They can create things like maps of spaces. So it could be like a sound map in the garden or a map that's kind of mapping out different plants that exist in the garden, but this can be used again outside of the garden as well. Okay, the fourth principle of place-based education is thinking about it going from local to global. So starting small scale and thinking about how does this space or our garden impact me, and then kind of taking that out, thinking about it in terms of the community or the school, the local community, regionally, and then like making it connect to the globally. So maybe the problem they're addressing is just within the garden, but are there ways they can think about how this connects? Because all these things connect. So how does this connect to the greater community? What's happening in our garden? How does that connect to global issues? So some ways that you can kind of implement the local to global principle in your teaching is using local and international news sources to identify connections to local and regional phenomena happening. Students can create like a local garden newspaper, report on challenges and wins related to food access in the garden, the community, and the region. Have students engage in a learning community. So maybe they're setting up meetings with local stakeholders or people even from like nonprofits maybe that are in other areas dealing with similar things. So that way they're kind of looking at what's happening here, but how is this similar thing happening in other spaces? And having students connect with other schools or communities to discuss like similar challenges and potential solutions to an issue. Fifth principle of place-based education is design thinking. So one thing that kind of sets design thinking, if you for this buzzword, apart from just regular design, is that it should be an approach that emphasizes empathy and collaboration when you're solving problems. So we're not just looking for a solution to a problem and creating a model of something that could do that, but we're really getting feedback from the people that are involved in that space. Getting feedback from people in the garden or people that use the garden if you're trying to design a solution to a problem in the garden, or surveying people out in the community if you're looking to solve a problem within the community. So you want to make sure that you are addressing, understanding your own bias and empathizing with others to determine the best opportunities for change. Some ways you can kind of set students up for design thinking is letting the classroom or even the garden become kind of a maker space, thinking about using reduce, reuse, recycle, using the 3 R's. So how can you be sustainable? What can we reuse or repurpose in our design? Again, getting community feedback and looking to local industry partners to help students identify needs and solutions. And the final principle is that it's interdisciplinary. So the curriculum should match the real world. It should be integrated in the content and frequently project-based. So one thing you can ask yourself is what skills and knowledge are required by decision makers in the community in order to address a change. And this question, if students ask this when they're looking for a solution, it can lead to lots of different interdisciplinary research. So when you're designing a place-based unit, You can do this by just building on an existing unit you already have that already has the standards covered, and think about ways to incorporate place-based education and some of these different cross-curricular concepts. Using that asset mapping that I showed you is going to make it interdisciplinary because you're looking at many different people with different skills in the region that can come together for this. And then also thinking about just getting other teachers involved and having partner collaborations. Okay, so those are the 6 principles. So it's a lot of information. You might be thinking, okay, now what do I do with it? Where do I begin? So again, really, you can begin just about anywhere. If you're teaching a unit, we'll go back to like the erosion, a unit on erosion, and you just start with maybe having students look at, well, I don't know if erosion would be the best one, but maybe looking at like water bills if you're talking about water. That could be a start. They're starting to connect it to the space they live and understand it in that way. Or maybe taking a field trip somewhere. I mean, that's fine. That's a fine place to start and just slowly start to pull in some of these concepts. Or maybe you're comfortable with them and you want to start by designing a place-based unit. But 2 common implementation methods for place-based education I'm going to talk about briefly. So 1, this is also a principle, the local to global, but this is also kind of a way to start implementing place-based education. So if you think about starting, if your students like are used to learning in the classroom, they haven't done a lot of they're not super connected to the spaces they inhabit or the community, then you can just start by using the scale. So the first thing you'd want to do is students start with themselves. So doing a cultural exploration, understanding themselves and how they kind of exist in a space. So I'm not going to go into a lot of these examples, but there are so many ways you can do this in the garden. And part 2 of this will really dive into this. So the part 2 class that follows this will be next Thursday at the same time. You can still register for it, but that will really dive into how students can explore their cultures and connect that to the garden. But that's a great place to start. And then from there, the students can think more about small spaces. So exploring out in the garden, doing those little micro ecosystems, like finding, looking under a rock and what do they understand about the space, and thinking about how that space, like these little bugs crawling around, how they connect to the greater space, to the garden, and then that to, the much bigger picture. But then from there, having students explore the garden ecosystem, using their senses to get a good, understanding of a space, mapping out the garden, thinking about how things interact in the garden. So maybe like companion planting and how pollinators affect the food. So just thinking about how all these things interact together. And then transitioning more into the community. So thinking about, again, historical practices in the community that maybe have affected food access or whatever the topic is that you're focusing on. Again, bringing in asset mapping, then thinking about assets in the community outside of the garden that are part of that identity of a space, and then connecting that to the local or to the global. So this is one way to approach it. And maybe you kind of start with younger students doing more of like the self and small exploration. And as students get older, they focus more on the other, but you can really do it. It doesn't have to work that way. So another implementation method is thinking of place-based education as a continuum. So you're starting with just doing little things. Like I said, maybe you're teaching a unit in the classroom pretty traditionally, but you're starting to bring in some local experts. So they're kind of thinking about what they're learning from their textbook and relating it to the community. Maybe they're starting to do a service project that's related to what they're learning. So those are kind of ways to start to like incorporate it. But the goal is then thinking about places as like the primary organizer for what they're learning. So thinking about using the community as a classroom, using inquiry-based, student-led, and designing real world solutions to the problem. Okay, and finally, maybe you've got all that down and you're ready to just design a unit using all place-based education or all of these principles that's connected to the garden. So one way of doing this, so Dean's going to go over in just a minute, just a few great examples of things that you could do if you just kind of want to start from scratch and create a garden-based place-based unit. But one way to kind of approach it is just thinking about these 3 points. So starting with having students identify a problem related to the garden or an issue that's meaningful to them and impacts their garden and as well as their community. So again, it could be a challenge in the garden that maybe the community can be brought in to help solve, or it could be more of a problem in the community that the garden can help solve, like food access or something like that. So once students have kind of identified that problem, started to identify like assets, or then they can start to think about like assets in the community that can help with this problem, help look for solutions. They can start creating inquiry or different tools for inquiry-based learning. So maybe they're creating surveys, collecting feedback from the community, collecting data, and starting to explore different solutions with all of that feedback. And then, so that's the final one. Then students with that feedback from the community, they start looking for designs that emphasize empathy and collaboration. So it's just kind of an easy way to think about organizing it. And now Dean's going to talk about some specific examples. So if you really want some examples to help get you started, Dean has some great ideas.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go through kind of 3 like very garden specific ideas. So just like some very like, I mean, simple, I guess, like not like big systemic issues, but like simple issues that you might have in your garden, and then kind of talk through ways that you do that. So I'm going to use I language because I did most of these myself in terms of going through it, but they kind of exemplifies those ideas. But you can see kind of how you could do that with kids, or like what kind of stages you could do with students. So like one would be, and it's pretty common in gardens. So one is you might identify that you've got, problem in your garden, your squash plants keep dying. So that could be, summer squash like zucchini, pumpkins, things like that. And you might just keep having issues with them where they're dying. This is a really common thing we hear from people all the time around here. And a lot of times people don't know what's causing it, or they just assume it's this bug that they see all the time, like called squash bugs, that like, oh, my plants died, I saw the squash bugs are killing it, so I need to figure out how to just kill all the squash bugs. But it's important sometimes to step back, because usually that's not actually what's causing your squash to die. So something that we need to do is, like example is you'd step back and you'd say like, okay, problem is my squash keep dying. What is causing it? And then you really need to like observe and see like what is doing it. Like, is it the squash bugs? Is it something else? Like what are kind of the signs? What are the symptoms? And one of the things that's common with squash is you might see a squash kind of slowly decline and then die. But usually what you'll see is your squash might not look super happy, but it's doing its thing. And then all of a sudden you just show up one day and the whole thing is just wilted. And that is very classically caused by a bug called squash vine borer. So, you could, if you have an issue with your squash, you kind of like look at the symptoms, try and look up like, look through literature, try to find people like extension agents, or, reach out to an organization like us or something. And basically, with your observations of like, not just the squash is dead, but like, well, how is it dead? When is it happening? How long is it taking? Like, what are the signs? What are the symptoms? And then a lot of times that person could easily tell you, oh, it's squash vine borers. Like that's very classically like how they die. Well, then the question is like, well, what do you do about that? And a lot of times the answer from people is, well, it just kind of happens. And so if you look into squash vine borers, so this was something that I went through when I was in college, trying to figure out, I want to grow squash. I don't understand why I can't grow squash. And at the time I was working at Cahokia Mounds, and I knew that like they grew squash here for thousands of years. And I also knew from just like looking up and through extension research that vine borers are native. They're a native insect. And so like the insect has been here for thousands of years and the plant has been here for thousands of years. And yet we know Native Americans grew squash. So like, how did they do it? And so like finding that information, I was then like, all right, well, that's what I'm going to seek out. Like, how did they do it? Like, because the answer could be, spray your plants with lots and lots of poison. Which actually is not super effective for squash vine borers, but you could do that. But that's probably not what most people want to do, especially at schools. And so, like, what other options are there? And if you look through, one of the things that I found as I was reaching out to people who studied what was grown at Cahokia, what indigenous people did, was that there was this shift that happened where they were growing this Cucurbita pepo, subspecies ovifera, so this native squash. And then all of a sudden, a different squash was introduced from Mexico, and they basically stopped growing that native squash and started growing the Mexican squash, almost like across the board throughout kind of the St. Louis area. And for a long time, they didn't really know why. And it turns out the reason why is squash vine borers. Because also, as I was looking through research and reaching out to people and talking with experts about it, they said that, squash vine borers definitely have preferences. So there's 4 species of squash, and there's like the species that they love the most is Cucurbita pepo, so the one that was domesticated here. And then there's some that they kind of like, in the middle, that they're like, they'll eat them, but they're not their favorite. And then the one that they really don't like is Cucurbita moschata. So then, like I find that out, and then I'm like, all right, well, where do I find one of those? And then you gotta like, and then I was reaching out to like, well, how would I figure that out? And then again, reaching out to extension agents, looking through seed catalogs, contacting seed companies, being like, what do you have that's actually a Cucurbita moschata? Because they don't always publish that. And then I got together a whole bunch of different Cucurbita moschata squash, planted them all to see which ones actually wanted to grow here and would survive, because a lot of them still got the vine borer and died, but some of them did really well. In particular, we found that tromboncino squash and Seminole pumpkin both do really great, that they're very resistant to that pest. And so we now grow that in the garden. That's like, those are honestly for me the only 2 squash I grow anymore, because I don't want to deal with this bug. But I had to go through and like ask the questions and then do the trials, figure it out, reach out, kind of do that exploration to figure out what could be the problem, what are potential solutions, try those solutions, and then actually grow those to like make sure they work, not just on paper, but do they actually work here in my garden in St. Louis, and then do it.
There are so many standards that just naturally, don't know, take away from the fact that students have to learn specific standards, but there's so many ways to incorporate math. Engineering obviously is a natural part of this, but even, English concepts as they're reading, as they're writing, it's all kind of naturally, organically happening there.
Yeah. And then another one. So this one's another one. If you have fruit trees, one is, maybe you growing peaches, and you start noticing, oh, I'm getting this weird stuff on my peaches, where like the tips of the branches kind of look like weird thing, where they're kind of like almost shredded and dead. The whole branch isn't dying, and then like little fruit are getting this little like gummy stuff that's coming out, little holes kind of thing. You're like, well, what's causing that? Like, what's going on? Does my tree have a disease? Is it a bug? Is it, like, what is it? Because like a lot of times this looks like 2 different things, right? So then you would again have to like look out and identify what's the problem. So like there's something going on with the peaches. Like this doesn't look normal. It looks like there's something wrong. How do I figure out what's wrong? And again, you could reach out through, extension agents. You could reach out to us. The Give and Grove, which is the broader program that we work with for our orchard program, has some resources on their website to help identify issues with peach trees. Or you could reach out to peach farmers. Sometimes, like particularly if somebody knows one, they're usually happy to talk about it, as long as you can catch them when they're not too busy. And reach out to them and be like, this is what I got. Like, what do you think? And usually someone is going to be able to tell you what the problem is, or direct you to someone who might know. Because even if you don't know where to start, just starting by asking somebody who seems like they're in the area, even if they don't have the answer, they can usually refer you to somebody. And most people who do this kind of thing are happy to talk to people who have questions, particularly students that have questions.
A lot of time there's other learning that takes place along the way.
Yeah, that they can like, questions that come up. And so this specific issue is actually oriental fruit moth. So it's an introduced moth that the caterpillar, the moth will lay eggs, and in the early spring, they lay them on the ends of the branches. And so they'll eat the ends of the branches. And then once the fruit starts forming, they lay them in the fruit. But there are other caterpillars that get laid, but only on the fruit. So again, it's a thing that like, if you're looking at it and you're looking at the whole problem, it's really easy if you're seeing both of these things to know that's oriental fruit moth. If you're just like, oh, there's some gum on the fruit, well, that could be like one of 3 or 4 things. When you're seeing both of these, so you got like looking at the whole problem and thinking that like this could all be one thing. It might also be multiple things. And so like it's a bit of a puzzle that you need to, so that's why it's really helpful to reach out to people and look at kind of all of your options. But with Oriental fruit moth, once you identify that it's Oriental fruit moth, then the question becomes, okay, well, what do we do about it? Or I guess the first question is it a problem? It is. But then like, what do we do about it? And there's chemical options you can spray that will kill the Oriental fruit moth. There's, more organic options you can use that are not as toxic that you can spray. But there's also things like boosting native predators of Oriental fruit moth or things like that. And one thing that is actually strangely helpful that they've found, and they've tested these in peach orchards in California, where they found that if they plant sunflowers around the peach trees, the Oriental fruit moth population drops in half. And so like that's pretty significant. And just like if you're researching and you find that like, oh, somebody says that, well, then you can try it. You can plant those sunflowers, have them grow, and then see like, do you see any improvements or not? And you can also eat the sunflowers if you want. But and then my third example that I'll give here is another one that came up where a very common problem. You have weeds in your garden. There's lots of ways to deal with weeds. Most of them is just pull them out or cut them or smother them or something like that. But just one particular example that I like to give is with me. One thing that happened was I was reading an article one day. So amaranth. They're also called pigweeds. Sometimes they're the same thing, but a lot of times they're called pigweeds when people are talking about them as a weed, and they call them amaranth when they're talking about them as food because they're both. But when I was working at Cahokia, I remember there was a whole big hubbub that was happening because down in Georgia there was an amaranth called Palmer amaranth that had developed Roundup resistance all on its own, just through natural selection, and was just like taking over whole fields because the Roundup wasn't working. The farmers didn't have cultivating tractors anymore. And so they didn't know what to do. And so they just abandoned the fields. It was like thousands of acres that were getting abandoned because they didn't know what to do about it. And again, I remember sitting there thinking like, they're growing these in fields of beans and corn, and they're having to abandon the fields. But then I was like, well, where is Palmer amaranth from? Because like, it's from somewhere, like someone has dealt with it for a long time. And I looked it up and it's from here. And so then I was like, okay, well, we know that indigenous people grew beans and corn and they had Palmer amaranth. And so again, the question is like, well, then what did they do? Like, obviously they didn't just abandon fields when it showed up because it was already here. It was always here and they didn't have Roundup. They weren't spraying Roundup on it. And so again, I just started like asking those questions and looking, and I, at the time I worked at Cahokia, so it was really easy, but like talk to these researchers at Cahokia or reaching out to researchers at universities that are studying this kind of thing. They're basically like, how did they deal with weeds? Like, what did they do? And it turns out for pigweed, the answer is they ate it. Real easy solution. Here we're like, oh my gosh, let's abandon thousands of acres and spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars to develop new chemicals to deal with it. And the indigenous solution was eat it because it is edible in basically all of its forms. The leafy part is edible. So when it's really little, what they would do is they would just what I learned talking to some people was they had these baskets. They would walk through the fields and they would hand weed the plants, which is a lot of work, but they would hand weed the plants, pull the whole thing up by the roots, throw them in the basket, and then they would take the basket back to their house and they would wash them. And the whole plant, like stem, root, leaves, everything. When the plants are pretty little, they're not like big giant things at this point. They would throw them in a big pot and they would boil them until they were soft. And then they would let it cool down and they would scoop it out and they would just squish them into a ball and then set them on a rock and dry them in the sun. And that was what they ate for greens in the winter. That was how they didn't get scurvy in the winter, was this thing that we're like, oh my gosh, crisis, what do we do? Like it was literally the thing that was like the storable vitamin C and nutrients for a whole civilization. And so again, like just thinking about like, it seems like a big problem because amaranth can spread very quickly. One plant can produce 500,000 seeds. And so like, if you're not harvesting it or you're not weeding it, it can get out of control really fast. But if you instead look and think about it like, well, this is a plant. It grew somewhere. Somebody dealt with it long before chemicals, long before even, metal tools in some instances. And so like, what did people do? Because people weren't growing just little raised beds, they were growing whole fields. And so there has to be something that was done with it. And a lot of these weeds that we consider as really awful weeds were brought here on purpose because they're food. So another example is, again, another one that I kind of alluded to is lamb's quarters. So lamb's quarters, it's kind of what they look like. They can be small. Again, this is a relative of quinoa. It can produce a lot of seeds. And so again, can be very weedy and can produce a lot of weeds, and they can get really tall. And so they can be a problem where they can, shade your other plants. But again, there was a native one here, and the one that mostly grows now is from Europe. And people farmed in both of those places for a long time. And so how did they deal with it? And again, the answer was they ate it, because it's, again, really nutritious. And in both the instances of lamb's quarters and amaranth, if you then look at like, well, how do you eat it? And then, that's a whole nother series of questions, is how do you eat it? How do you cook it? How do you prepare it? What is the nutrition? Like, is this thing that we consider a weed actually helpful for food access and nutrition? And the answer for lamb's quarters and amaranth, for both of those, is absolutely. They're not only good for you, they're more nutritious than virtually everything we grow on purpose. And so again, like, this problem could become the solution if you ask the questions and you talk to people and you like figure out then like, well, how do people cook it? And maybe people in your neighborhood are already doing that. I run into people all the time that eat lamb's quarters. I've even been to some community gardens where they will adopt the weedy bed, not plant anything, and just harvest the weeds. But like, that's something that they grew up with, and so they know how to do. And so if you see that bed, maybe go talk to that person. Be like, hey, what do you do?
And I love that example, because if you think back to that triangle and prism I showed in the beginning, it's all there. So that study alone can teach you about cultures, teach you about ecology, how things work together. So you could get into economy there a little bit. And then thinking about the prism, we talk about the history of this. How did it get here? What did they do with it? What do we do with it now? And then even thinking about the future, or thinking about like even globally, like maybe the way we're managing these things now, what impact will that have? And it's all there in that one, problem and solution by, yeah.
Yeah, and for future, to the thing too that you're saying, like, so amaranth is one too that is actually one of the most heat and drought tolerant plants that we have. That's a food plant, which again, we consider it as a weed, and it's one of the reasons why it's such a problematic weed. But with climate change, it's being looked at more and more as a plant that can be really helpful in areas that are hit with drought, hit with extreme heat, because it will grow in those places. But again, here mostly just because it's something we're not familiar with. It's like, oh, it's a weed. Just got to figure out how to kill it.
Awesome. Thank you, Dean. So impeccable timing. So that's all we have. I do see, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And here's just some resources I used. Again, David Sobel is kind of known as one of the he developed the philosophy. So he has many books related to place-based education. I also pulled a lot of this from The Power of Place, another book. And then Teaching Science School has some really great resources too, and some of the diagrams I showed you. They also have like getting started guides and all of that. Okay, I see someone had said the chat is disabled. Happy. Okay, great. Any questions? We'll stay on for a minute if anyone has any, or if you have anything else that you wanted to add, Dean.
No, but yeah, you can like I said, questions you can just throw in the Q&A. I don't really have anything else other than like in the second part, or the class coming up. Did you want to?
No, go ahead. I was going to mention it as well.
Okay, I was just gonna say, it's coming up. So we'll elaborate more on some of these, and for my part, I will elaborate more on more global crops. So not necessarily just the things that are local here, but things that are from other regions of the world that you can grow here. Like if you're wanting to talk about a specific culture, a specific place, because we can't grow bananas, or things like that. But there are things from basically every region of the world that we can grow here. And we've trialed a lot of those in our demonstration garden. And so we have some recommendations there for really any region of the world that you would want talk about or culture that you would want to talk about, we'll kind of go over some options for you.
Thank you for mentioning that. Abby Schumacher, who is educator at Seed St. Louis, will be leading that class along with Dean. And I highly recommend it. Again, this is more kind of an overview of place-based education, but Abby will really be diving into some more specific ways, specifically connected to using the community as classroom and making it learner-centered. So really thinking about students connecting with their cultures and their sense of place related to that. And I will also have a good kind of handout resource that we have on our website, but that connects with some of the stuff Dean will be talking about too. So still sign up for that on our website, and that'll be next Thursday at 6 o'clock. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So thank you all for joining, and hope to see you next week.